All right, so welcome to another live stream for iOS. Today we're going to talk about architecting large iOS applications. Now, a lot of the times people will just start their application without any planning. They'll start with the first screen, they'll add another screen, they'll tie those two together, they'll add a third screen, they'll try to tie those in, a fourth and a fifth, and then pretty much before they know it, you have spaghetti code. So, we're going to show you how to properly plan and architect an iOS application. There's a great thing that we've added recently in iOS called storyboards. This has been around for a number of years now, but with storyboards, it's actually a really nice way of laying out your interface. And so if you're familiar with it, you lay out your interface, how they relate to other views, other view controllers, whether it's in a tab view controller or whatever. So we launched the second viewer here, view controller, excuse me, etc., etc. Maybe this one launches 2 different views, that sort of thing. And soon you have a nice layout. And so we're going to start off with this kind of concept where we are going to define what our application looks like, and then what it's going to have in it, and then also what the kind of communication and variables and other data that needs to be passed back and forth. So we're going to start off, usually what I like to do is start off with a rough sketch on paper and pencil, so that's what we're going to do here, and then go ahead and talk about what kind of data needs to be passed back and forth. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a maintenance application for a car. So we're going to call this car maintenance. Oops, my handwriting is terrible. Maintenance. All right, so we're going to define some of the pieces of data that we want to keep in this application and to store later. And then we might actually build out this application later. We refer back to this plan here. So for car maintenance, obviously we're going to want to have the make, the model of the car, right? The year. This doesn't really matter too much in terms of data and data manipulation, but we do want to have a screen that will allow us to enter in this type of information. And maybe some additional information on that, such as the mileage, maybe the color, maybe a photo, etc. So you can see that this list is getting kind of long. And so this will actually dictate what our interface looks like. Because again, sometimes people just start designing their interface and they'll create a text box for the make, they'll create a text box for the model, and they'll create a text box for every one of these. And then they kind of have this interface that's just a linear list instead of something a little bit more organized. So we know that let's say we want to restrict our data input to just these when we're setting up a car. So let's say that we have an add a car screen here, and that's going to have some of our input fields. I'm just going to quickly add here. And then once we add that car, it's going to go to our main screen, something like this. And maybe we have multiple cars on here. Now, because most people don't own too many cars, maybe we'll make those in a table view, and that table view, each row is going to be a couple hundred pixels to be really large each. So maybe an exploded view of that main be something like this, where we probably suspect people on average maybe own 1 to 2 cars. Maybe they own a third, and that's fine. And then for your car enthusiasts, they'll have to scroll a little bit, but that's going to be kind of an edge case there where it goes off the screen. All right, so for our first add screen, you enter the application. It's going to immediately ask you to add in these things. And so our interface for this is going to be a make row here. It's going to say make, and then maybe we tap on that, and it launches us into a second activity, or a second view controller. Sorry, I just did the Android live stream, so getting my terminology confused. So this is going to be a view controller. When you click on make, it's going to maybe pull down every single car make in a list. Maybe that's embedded in the application. We don't know yet. We're just kind of defining all these different makes. And then based on that make, it's going to have a model. Okay, and then that list, when we tap on it, maybe it's not enabled until we select the make. Now model's enabled, and it has a nice list of just the models that that car manufacturer produced. And then sometimes you have a year before, so maybe we'll erase this and drawing on the same layer, so of course it deletes both of these. This is why it's really nice to put this into paper and pencil. All right, so we have the year, we have the make, we have the model, etc. And based on our entries on here, it kind of defines our interface layout for the rest of this. So it's really nice not to have to pick from 1,000 different models from every car manufacturer. Just pick the make, narrows down our list of the model. Maybe we can combine these two into one if that makes sense, but I'm going to leave it as 2 view controllers right now. So right off the bat, we have 3 view controllers. The year might just be a text field that pops up here with a keyboard, a numeric keyboard, etc. So we can only type in numbers. Maybe it's a UI picker controller, which is probably a little bit better for years. And yeah, so we have this. Okay, so again, we have this basic information. We have color. Again, maybe that's some kind of picker, but I'm going to actually put that into its own view controller. And then finally, we have a photo of the car. We'll use that as the thumbnail, etc. So you add all these, and then maybe we have a plus button up here, or a save button, excuse me, probably be a save button, at the top of our application. All right, so our interface is going to dictate what the architecture is going to look like for our code. Now, you can keep these two things separate, and that's a good idea, but it's obviously a good idea to also know what your interface is going to look like so you can know what data to retain and keep and manipulate and all those things. Because you don't want to be doing operations on an interface that'll never show that piece of data. All right, so for the photo one, we actually want to launch another activity, a view controller. That is the camera. So I'm just going to draw a little camera because that's going to pop up the camera. All right, so now we have 5 different view controllers. 5 different view controllers. When we're done with putting in all that data, we have a saved button. That save button is going to save the car, and it's going to drop us into our main view controller that we talked about before. Okay, excuse my poor drawing here, but we're going to have a button that allows us to add an additional vehicle at some time. We have the header here, and probably put either the name of the application up here or something of that nature, and then really big rows. A little bit of a tip on your interface design is you don't want to make that row exactly the same height as your screen. You actually want to kind of expose a little bit below so that the user knows that there's additional data down there and will scroll. Obviously, they will know because they've added more data, but in case they've added 2 cars, they won't see it if it's below that fold. So you want to make sure that there's a little bit showing so they know there's additional data down there and they can go ahead and scroll down there. Okay, so in this one, we're going to have a photo and then maybe some information, make, model, etc. Here. Don't worry about your neatness. We're just kind of getting a layout of the land. All right, so you get the idea. You tap on this, it's going to show another view controller. Everything's crooked, but there we go. So again, maybe we just have a thumbnail image, make, model, all this stuff from the first one. And then in here, here's where we have the mileage, oil change, all the different pieces of information that we want about the car. All right, so I could go on with the design of my application, adding different features, but I think this is good because as you can see, this is starting to grow pretty rapidly in terms of a simple application. But how are we going to pass all this data back and forth? So we have this add view controller. Let's call it add main, and then I'll call this one details. So when you add via this screen. By the way, before I forget, this plus button launches that view controller. All right, so we have all these view controllers kind of showing each other and passing data all between each other. So normally what you'd probably do is when I hit that save button, you'd call a function and then you'd pass that data to maybe your main view activity, your view controller, excuse me. And your view controller would, when it goes to see the details, it would pass that data here. And maybe I edit some details on that car and then I have to pass it back. Well, this is a really, really messy architecture, and you can see when I start drawing those interaction arrows that the interaction arrows get really, really complex. And they'll get way more exponentially complex if I add other view controllers that need to get data passed back and forth, or maybe this needs to add it here. So terrible solution, don't do that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to have a controller down here, sometimes called a manager. And it's not a view controller, it's just a regular controller. It's going to be a class. And what this class is going to do is contain a whole bunch of static methods and members to keep track of our car data. So I would call this maybe a car controller. This is going to add all sorts of functionality. When we add a car, it's going to create a car model object, and that car model object is going to have all that data in it, make, model, year, etc. Oil changes, all that fun stuff, and they're either going to be represented as integers or other classes, arrays, dictionaries, all that fun stuff. So you might have some other helper classes down here. Again, oil change. Oil change might have at what mileage it was changed, how much oil, what kind of oil, the date, all that fun information. So that would be something like that if I could fit the word oil in here. Okay, so you get the idea. So all this contains classes within classes, and this is going to be car model. All right, so then in our car controller, if you remember, Apple really likes the model view controller methodology or paradigm. So our car controller will have maybe an array, I'm just going to denote this with 2 angle brackets, that's going to contain a list of all of our cars. But as a user of the car controller, namely as a programmer, we don't necessarily care whether that implementation is an array, because it could be an array, it could be a dictionary, it could be a database. We don't really know, nor do we care. What we're going to do instead is we're going to interact with this car controller via a method, and maybe it's going to be called, not that, cars, and that will pass back an array of those cars. Or we can say, car with ID. And we'll pass it some ID. We'll take a parameter, namely ID. And that'll pass back a car object. Something of that nature. All right, and so when we add a car, we'll have another method called add car, or append car, or whatever you want to call it. And that'll take a parameter of car. Part of my terrible handwriting, but there you go. And so the reason why we put it into a car controller is because now the interactions between this and the architecture for this is going to be a lot more clean. And everybody knows that if I'm manipulating cars or I'm doing something with cars, I'm going to go to the car controller. If I want a car, I go to the car controller. I don't have to remember that all the cars are stored in the main view controller. So we have a car controller that has an add method. It has a maybe a remove method. And it has some other methods on here that we can do some operations on the car and the car collections. And so maybe this one is private, this car array. All right, well, here's the deal. When we have the details and we add, or excuse me, when we have the add screen and we add a new car, we're going to use this. So add, that goes to the car controller. Now, how does the table view in the main view controller know that a car was just added? Well, you might think that it would poll the car controller or even ask the car controller, hey, what happened, or go get me a list of all the cars. And so we call this method here. And then it goes up here and just displays all the list of cars. Well, maybe I remove a car, or some other view removes a car, and then I come back to here. Is it a good idea to poll all of the cars and then refresh the table view? Maybe. In our case, that's okay because there's only maybe 1 or 3 cars. But when you're talking about data that may have thousands of records, you're not going to want to reload that table view with all of those, with all that data, because the data may not have changed. So again, if you're doing like on view appeared or on view did load, that you're pulling that data and refreshing your table view, or you're reloading your table view data, that's a bad practice. Instead, you just want to do it on demand. So when a car gets added, that add method will actually broadcast a signal using the notification center. And I have a video on the channel that talks exactly about how this works. But it'll broadcast a message throughout the entire application and say, hey, a car was just added. And over here in my main view controller, the main VC, I want to register as an observer of that message. So I care about the fact that a car was added. So I'm going to add myself as an observer to that message or that notification. And then also I want to know if they've been removed. So if they've been removed, then I obviously want to know about that so that I can remove that cell or that row in that table view. In my details, maybe I want to know that the data was also updated. And so there might be just a method on here called update. I promise I can normally spell. So when you update a car, a piece of data in that car model, well, maybe this details view controller, it saves the data, and that's it. It just saves the data, and that's what happens. But if it's stored to a database, you want to make sure that that database actually persists and writes that to disk. And so maybe there is a method up in there that says update this data, or update this car with this data. All right, so when that happens, it also broadcasts a message. And because the data in here doesn't get updated until you tell the table view to reload, just because I went to the details doesn't mean I changed the data. So when I come back here, I don't want to necessarily reload that data on here again because there's going to be a delay. So we register for that update, and only on these messages or these notifications that come back through the car controller, as again broadcasting out there, we say, okay, one of these messages happened, go ahead and refresh the data in the main view controller or car view controller. That might go down to the car controller and say, okay, refresh my list of cars. And again, you never want to put all of your data in your view controllers. Always have a third object that retains that. And we call this a Singleton pattern. So this car controller, only one of these will ever exist. So this is going to be called a singleton. One of it always exists, that's why it's called a singleton. But also, we can't ever have multiple car controllers. That doesn't really make sense. If you want to have some kind of functionality for garages, I would probably just attach that as a piece of data to the car model and say which garage is it in. But again, we would never have multiple car controllers in here. So this is the first step in architecting an application. Never store any data that other view controllers care about in your view controller. That doesn't make any sense. Again, I have to go and figure out which view controller has that data and then go look it up there, which means I need a reference to that view controller, and now you're coupling your application to each other, and that's just, again, bad architecture. So hopefully this makes sense to you. Feel free to ask questions in the chat and let me know if this makes sense to you. But if you're watching this after the fact, feel free to put a comment in the video below, and I'll help you out and walk you through this a little bit more if you need a little bit better explanation on this. But hopefully, again, you get the gist of this, and we'll talk about additional architecture in future videos. All right, well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.